In 1860, Louisiana felt like a land holding its breath. The Mississippi Delta stretched wide and green beneath a sky that seemed permanently bruised by heat. The air clung to skin, thick with the sweet perfume of cotton blossoms and the sour, metallic scent of sweat and river mud. Fields shimmered white in the sun, promising wealth to those who owned them and endless toil to those who did not. Beneath that beauty, beneath the steady rhythm of planting and picking, lay something darker, an understanding that every fortune in that soil was rooted in bondage. Delaney Plantation stood only a few miles from New Orleans, close enough that the distant noise of the city sometimes rode the wind. Wagon wheels, shouting merchants, the hollow echo of auctioneers selling human beings beneath open skies. The plantation itself was modest 200 acres that from a distance suggested prosperity. Up close, the illusion faltered. Fence posts leaned like exhausted sentries. The fields were uneven, and weeds crept between cotton rows where hands had not been enough. The big house, a 2-story wooden structure painted white long ago, showed the faint sag of rot beneath its boards. In certain light, it looked dignified. In others, especially at dusk, it resembled a tired animal that had been beaten too many times and still refused to fall. Clement Delaney was 45, a man of average height and once average ambition. His brown hair had begun to gray, and his face bore the permanent tension of someone who had long ago mistaken control for strength. His hands were calloused from work, though he preferred to frame that fact as virtue rather than necessity. He owned 15 enslaved people, 8 men and 7 women, a number that placed him in a precarious middle ground. Enough to feel superior, not enough to feel secure. His wife, Joanna, was 38 and carried grief like a second spine. She had once been lively, her laughter quick and her movements bright. Years of worry had softened her into something quieter. Fine lines traced her face, especially around her mouth, where smiles no longer came easily. She had given birth 4 times and buried 1 child. 3 daughters remained. Arlene, 19, striking in her stillness with golden hair and eyes so blue they seemed cold even in summer. Carolyn, 17, delicate and prone to illness, as if the world had always weighed heavier on her than on others. And Frida, 15, whose restless energy had not yet been fully subdued by the oppressive rules of her upbringing. The enslaved community at Delaney Plantation was small but tightly bound by shared suffering. Tobias, around 30, was broad-shouldered and observant, trusted by Clement as an informal overseer because he seemed calm and compliant. Leah, 25, worked in the big house, moving through hallways with quiet efficiency. Most of the others had been born on the property, their lives unfolding entirely within the boundaries Clement considered his. For years, the Delaney name had hovered on the edge of respectability. Clement was not a cotton baron, but he maintained appearances. He attended church, shook hands with neighboring landowners, and spoke in the polished tone expected of a Southern gentleman. The truth, however, had begun to decay beneath the surface. In 1858, a blight swept through the cotton. Fields that should have yielded profit yielded half. The loss struck like a sudden illness. Clement borrowed money from merchants in New Orleans at ruinous interest rates, convincing himself that next season would redeem him. Instead, pressure mounted. Creditors began appearing at the plantation gates, their boots spotless, their expressions cool. They spoke of legal obligations and property seizure with the detached precision of surgeons preparing to amputate. At the same time, Clement developed a habit that grew into an addiction: gambling. What began as a night of distraction in the city turned into frequent disappearances. He would return in the early hours, the smell of whiskey and cigar smoke clinging to his clothes, frustration etched into his features. Joanna heard him pacing at night, muttering to himself in his office, scratching numbers onto scraps of paper only to crumple them in fury. When Clement was forced to sell 3 enslaved men to cover his debts, something in him snapped. The sale was humiliating. Word spread quickly among neighboring planters. Clement felt their pity like a knife. During the negotiation, he examined the men clinically lifting chins, inspecting teeth, commenting on muscle and breeding potential as though discussing livestock. Even seasoned traders seemed unsettled by the cold detachment in his voice. Dr. Reuben McCormick, who occasionally visited the plantation, noticed the change in Clement. The man who once spoke in measured tones had become sharp, restless. He asked strange questions about fertility, about inheritance laws, about the legal status of children born to enslaved women. He borrowed law books. He studied slave codes. McCormick told himself it was stress. But he could not ignore the feverish light in Clement's eyes when he spoke of productivity. Sheriff Peter Mullins, too, observed something altered. Clement avoided eye contact during routine visits. Mullins attributed it to financial embarrassment. He did not consider that shame can rot into something far worse. That winter, Clement locked himself in his office for hours at a time. Joanna would find him hunched over borrowed volumes, scribbling notes by lamplight. He would hide the pages quickly when she entered, offering vague explanations about protecting the family. The daughters began noticing his gaze lingering too long on them, evaluating, measuring. Arlene once confided to her mother that she felt examined, as though her father were assessing her in ways she could not name. Joanna felt unease settle into her chest like a stone. Leah also sensed the shift. Clement began questioning her about her health, her age, her reproductive history. He asked similar questions of the younger enslaved women. He reorganized sleeping quarters, separating men and women more strictly. He installed new locks in the big house, claiming fear of slave uprisings as tensions in the South grew. Yet some locks seemed positioned to imprison rather than protect. In January 1860, Clement traveled to New Orleans for several days. When he returned, he carried a leather briefcase and spoke of a man named Boggart, an expert in paperwork, in legal adjustments. Boggart, operating from a dim office above a tavern in the French Quarter, specialized in forging birth and baptismal certificates. For a steep price, he could make the law say whatever a client needed it to say. Clement had discovered the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum. A child followed the status of its mother. If the mother was enslaved, so was the child. If the mother was free, the child was free. To Clement, this was not moral principle, it was opportunity. His plan was monstrous in its logic. His daughters were free. Their children would legally be free. But if he could falsify documentation to list an enslaved woman as the mother, those children could be sold. He could transform his own grandchildren into property. The plan did not arrive all at once. It grew inside him like mold in damp wood. He began isolating his daughters from society, canceling visits and restricting correspondence. He administered herbal mixtures under the guise of protecting their health, substances intended to regulate fertility. He tracked menstrual cycles in a locked ledger. He spoke increasingly of sacrifice, of duty, of the necessity of saving the family from ruin. In October 1860, he called Arlene into his office. The shutters were drawn halfway, the room dim. Clement spoke calmly, as if proposing a business arrangement. Arlene would bear a child. Tobias would be the father. The child would be sold for the good of the family. Arlene recoiled in horror. She refused. Clement's face remained cold. He locked her in her room for 3 days, giving her only bread and water. He returned repeatedly, showing her debt documents, describing foreclosure, humiliation, the loss of everything. He alternated threats with twisted appeals to filial duty. By the 3rd day, Arlene's resistance fractured, not from belief, but from terror. Carolyn collapsed into sobs when informed. Frida shouted that she would rather die. Clement responded with a simple truth. He would force them if necessary. The house was locked down. Escape was impossible. What followed was a systematic regime of coercion. Clement scheduled encounters with obsessive precision, based on the calculations in his ledger. Tobias, threatened with violence and death, obeyed under duress. The details of those nights remained unspoken, but their aftermath was visible in the daughters' faces. Hollow eyes, trembling hands, long silences at the dinner table. By December, Arlene was pregnant. Clement recorded the expected birth date. Carolyn followed in January 1861. Frida in March, her young body ill-prepared for the strain. Clement treated each pregnancy as progress. Joanna confronted him when she understood the truth. Clement dismissed her protests, accusing her of hysteria. He warned her that interference would destroy them all. Joanna felt powerless, trapped within a legal and social system that granted Clement nearly absolute authority. In June 1861, Arlene went into labor. The birth was long and brutal. Leah assisted while Clement hovered nearby, concerned primarily with the infant's vitality. When the baby cried, Clement took him immediately. Arlene, pale and weak, reached for her child, but Clement turned away. Within a week, forged documents arrived naming Leah as the mother. 3 weeks later, Clement sold the child in New Orleans for $250. Arlene never saw him again. Carolyn's son was born in August. She hemorrhaged severely and nearly died. Clement expressed irritation at the complications, as though her suffering were a disruption in production. The baby was sold for $275. Frida gave birth in October. Her child was premature and frail. Frida sustained internal injuries that left her walking in pain. Clement sold the infant for less, complaining about diminished value. Leah's own child was taken without ceremony. She returned to work days later, her grief buried beneath obedience. The psychological toll deepened. Arlene became withdrawn, staring into space for hours. Carolyn suffered panic attacks and nightmares. Frida whispered to absent children. Joanna drank secretly at night, wandering the halls like a restless spirit. Clement forced new pregnancies in 1862. Arlene's second child was stillborn, provoking Clement's fury over loss. Carolyn's health deteriorated so badly that even Clement deemed her no longer viable. Frida, though weakened, was coerced again. Her suffering intensified. By January 1863, Frida saw no escape. Leah found her in the attic, hanging from torn sheets. She was 17. Joanna's grief turned to something harder than despair. Clement's reaction calculating, cold confirmed what she already knew. He had become something beyond redemption. After a hasty burial, Joanna began whispering with Tobias and others. The enslaved community, united by trauma, agreed that the only way to end the horror was to end Clement. On a stormy night in July 1863, Clement returned drunk from gambling. Hidden among the trees along the trail, Joanna and Tobias waited. The ambush was swift. Clement was dragged from his horse and killed. They staged the scene as robbery, scattering belongings, wounding the horse. Sheriff Mullins accepted the explanation without suspicion. War had made violence common. Joanna wept at the funeral, but relief lay beneath her tears. With Clement gone, the terror ceased. Joanna freed the enslaved people and sold the plantation. Tobias vanished northward. Leah left for New Orleans, seeking anonymity. Arlene gave birth again and was allowed to keep her child, though trauma clung to her like a second skin. Carolyn lived in fragile silence, her mind fractured. The official record reduced everything to simple lines. Clement killed by bandits. Frida dead of melancholy. No ledger recorded the price of stolen grandchildren. No document described the locks on bedroom doors. Delaney Plantation was eventually dismantled. The big house was torn down in the 1870s. Fields were replanted. Wind moved freely across land that once held so much suffering. But memory lingers where paper fails. The story of Delaney Plantation is not merely one of individual cruelty, but of a system that allowed cruelty to thrive. Clement's horror did not grow in isolation. It grew in soil already fertilized by dehumanization. The laws he twisted had been written to commodify human life. He simply extended their logic into his own bloodline. And that is perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. Evil did not arrive at Delaney Plantation with thunder or spectacle. It arrived quietly, disguised as necessity, justified by debt, supported by silence. It wore the face of a father and spoke the language of business. On certain nights when the wind moves through those old fields, there is no sound but rustling cotton and distant river water. The land remembers nothing, but stories do. And the story of Delaney Plantation remains a reminder that monsters are often born not from madness alone, but from the slow corrosion of conscience, one compromise, one rationalization, one ledger entry at a time.